Welcome class. Today we're going to cover cognitive levels and thinking maps unit 1. So this is an introduction lesson to cognitive levels and using thinking maps, and it will be a huge help for you guys in your exams. What you guys need to know is that Bloom's taxonomy is the taxonomy that teachers use in the classroom. We use it for all your tests and all your exams. So what is a taxonomy? Boiled down, a taxonomy is essentially a categorization of the work that we do. We categorize your work into different levels. So in 1956, Dr. Bloom essentially came up with a theory of how we can categorize the thinking levels or the cognitive levels that students and adults will be using. And he proposed that we essentially use at least 6 different categories. At the school, we take those 6 different categories and we sum them up into 3 different sections. Today we are going to cover section number 1. Okay, so according to Bloom's taxonomy, the categorization that we have would be, as we already mentioned, 6 different levels. For simplification, we do it like this. Okay, the top level would be where you create something new. Then, if you are evaluating, it would go at level number 5. If you are analyzing something, it goes at level 4. It goes to level 4. If you are applying your knowledge in a new situation, it goes to level 3. And then the levels that we are covering in this session would be the level 2, which requires you to understand something or remember something. When you are writing a test or an exam, you would find that we're testing all 6 levels. So if it is your goal to memorize something so that you could recall that information in an exam, you are really just focusing on level number 1. You have not studied for the other 2 levels that we will be testing you on. That's why we are having this lesson, so that you can understand what it is we're actually going to be testing you on as teachers. Not just recalling and understanding the information, but also analyzing it and creating new things with that information. Does anyone have any questions so far? Yes, Andrew.
So basically each section has a meaning to it. So each one will help you in a certain way or in a certain situation, correct?
Exactly. Each section does have a special meaning to it, and you've got to cover all of these 3 sections when you are studying. So you cannot just focus on one aspect and expect to pass. Depending on the grade and the subject, we test different percentages of your test or your exam on this. So for example, grade 4 social sciences, if we're doing a test on that, we would be looking at 30% of your exam paper focusing on this level, 50% would be focusing on this level, and the remaining 20% of your test would be focusing on the higher levels over here. So it depends on your grade and it depends on your subject, but we would be testing every single level in your tests.
And for our grade, what are the percentages?
It depends on the subject. So for your grade, it would be similar to this, although we would...
So say take English now.
Okay, so English we would be looking at 20% here, we would be looking at 50% here, and the remaining 30% here for English. Okay. But it does depend, as I said, on the grade and the subject that you are doing. But regardless of that, we would still be testing each and every single level. So all of your tests, all of your exams would be testing those cognitive levels. So as you can see from the PowerPoint presentation, we are looking at different sections. We've categorized it into the 3. When we look at cognitive level 1, we said that we are looking at remember and understand. Remember is simply recalling basic concepts and facts. Okay? So all we want you to do is to recall facts and concepts. That would be something as simple as which year was Nelson Mandela released from prison? Which year did we become, or rather South Africa, become a democratic country? So recalling basic facts, that is within this level. The other thing that we would be doing would be asking you to define ideas and concepts. When we are defining the ideas and concepts, we're looking at those facts and giving definitions for them. Okay? There are certain verbs that we use in each aspect. Within level 1, we would have words like identify, name, list, define. We would also ask you to compare and contrast. We would ask you to demonstrate and to interpret the information. Those are verbs that we are using, and if you see those verbs in your test, you understand what cognitive level they are asking you to evaluate. So, as previously mentioned, we look at certain verbs within this cognitive level. Cognitive level 1. If you see these verbs, this is the cognitive level that they are asking you to work on. Those are identify, name, list, define, compare, contrast, demonstrate, and interpret. When we use these verbs, each one is asking you to do something completely different. Have you ever looked at your exams or your tests and thought, hang on, they say, discuss this or explain that. Do you know what it is when they're asking you to discuss it or to explain it? Each and every single one of these verbs have a very specific instruction that it wants you to follow. When we ask you to explain something, it is not the same as if we are asking you to discuss something. Perhaps you've seen in natural science subjects where they say, compare and contrast the skeleton of a bird with the skeleton of a snake. Do you really feel comfortable that you know what compare and contrast means? Compare does not mean the same as contrast. Compare means to list the similarities between something. Contrast means to list the differences. That's a good question. Will comparing and defining the skeleton of a human and the skeleton of an animal be the same? No, they're not. Okay? Each verb is asking you to do something completely different. And we'll go through those now with you so that you can see when you see these verbs, not only do you know which cognitive level they're asking you to be working on, but also what is the instruction giving you? What are they asking you to do exactly? So that you don't go and explain the contrast when they are wanting you to compare things and give what is the same. So, The first verb that we have is identify. When they're asking you to identify something, they're essentially asking you to read the information that they are giving you and then provide a list or a summary of that information. Okay? So you're asked to identify what essentially could be key aspects, identify clues from the context. Okay? So you are listing the information that they want from you, or you are providing a summary of the information. So an example of what this would look like would be identify 5 points from the bar graph above and explain what information they are giving you. So you would then look at the bar graph. You would then list or summarize in a paragraph form the key points, the 5 key points that they want from you. So identify, when you're looking at the word identify, it's asking you simply to list or summarize the information. It's not asking you to interpret it. It's not asking you to explain it in your own words. It's just saying identify those key points and list them down for us. Does that make sense? Very good. So in English, you would be given something like a paragraph, and they would ask you to identify certain clues or key points from that paragraph. In natural science, you could be asked to identify the parts of a human body. So in English, you are given a sentence, and they ask you to identify the subject in that sentence and the predicate in that sentence. That's a very good one. Yes. The next verbs that they could ask you at this cognitive level would be to name something. Okay? When they're asking you to name something, they are simply asking you to provide a word or a term or a list of something. So name the different cognitive levels that they are. We're just asking you to provide the list in that case. Or perhaps name a certain term or provide a word from your context, from the subject that you're looking at. So you would then, in natural science, be asked to name the bones in the torso area, and you would then essentially provide the list for that. So in history, which is a part of social sciences, you could be asked to name a historical event. So out of the historical events that you have studied, you'd be asked to name one, which is where you are providing a word, a name for something. So you can see that this verb, it's literally asking you to provide a term or a word or a list. And in each case, you are looking at the cognitive level 1. You are recalling the facts. At this point, you're not asked to explain them or understand them. You're just recalling the information, which is why this verb would be placed under cognitive level 1. The next one that you could encounter would be to list, okay? And when they're asking you to list something, you would not be explaining a term or even providing a word. When they ask you to list something, you are essentially doing exactly that. You are providing a list, okay? So you can see how this differs from naming and identifying. Yes, in naming and identifying, you might be able to provide a list, like naming the 9 provinces in Southern Africa. You'd name all 9. But when you're asked to provide a list, you are strictly limited to providing that list. So the next verb that you would encounter at this cognitive level would be the word define. You guys, I'm sure, feel very comfortable with this verb. This verb is one that you've been using quite often. What verb would this mean? What does this mean? Yes, to give the meaning. Define would be the dictionary definition in some cases.
Or the keyword.
Exactly. So you'd either define it by providing keywords, or you could be providing the dictionary definition. Okay? Essentially, the goal of define is to provide the meaning. When you are providing the meaning of a word or even of a term, that is when you are defining something. So the word compare is something that I've already mentioned before in this video. Compare requires you to have two aspects that you are looking at. Two terms, two words, two aspects, two animals, exactly, okay? So what is required is that you have two aspects to look at, and then you are providing a list or a meaning, a paragraph, where you are looking at the similarities between these. So when you are looking at the similarities of two things, that is when you are comparing it. Can you have more than two things that you can compare? Do you think that there's more? You say yes. Give me an example of where you can have more than one. Oh, sorry, more than two things. That's very good. So in natural science, you could compare the neck of a giraffe with that of a zebra, with that of a horse. And you would be looking for similarities between those animals. Okay? If they give you a very specific thing to be looking at, so let's give you an example from English. We have two different types of poems. Let's take a haiku and let's take a limerick. Okay? If I were asking you to compare these things, there are very specific things that you could be looking for within poetry. So if you're given an option to compare any of those two poems, you could go and you would look at, okay, a haiku has a specific amount of syllables, very specific amount of lines. A limerick has only 5 lines and it has a very specific rhyme scheme. Okay, so we know the structure of the poems. Okay, now we've got to look at specific aspects. So now it's going away from what is the same between them, but rather what I want you to be looking at between them. So if I were to ask you to look at the structure, the typography, the rhyme scheme and the rhythm, those would be what I'm asking you to compare. What is the same between those aspects in these poems? Sometimes they are not the same, and sometimes they are the same. But I'm asking you to give me the similarities. The next thing that you could be asked to do would be to contrast something. Contrast is very similar to compare. You would be looking at two aspects, but unlike compare, you would be looking at the differences. If a teacher asks you to contrast the skeleton of a fish with the skeleton of a frog, you would be in error if you were to give the similarities. Contrast only means to give the differences, which is why it's very, very important for you to understand what each verb means. Yes, the verb allows us to understand which cognitive level we are operating on, but you need to know what each verb wants you to do, because your answer would be completely wrong if you were to contrast two things, if it's asking you to compare, and vice versa. They are not the same. Demonstrate is the next verb that we would be looking at. And demonstrate is actually quite easy. Demonstrate. All it really means is to show something. Okay? You are showing the teacher that you understand a concept. In English, we quite often have orals, and one of the orals that I love doing with my students would be a demonstrative oral, where you are showing to the class what you are doing. So not only are you having a conversation and you are presenting your oral, but you are using your hands and you're having a hands-on interaction with the class. Okay? You could even have a hands-on demonstration with showing the class how to use chopsticks or decorate cookies to look like monsters. So demonstrate really means to show. And you'd find quite often that if they are asking you to use this, that you would use something physical. You'd have to interact with an object. So in the school environment, it could be like using a map. Use a map and demonstrate that you understand your knowledge. They'll ask you to demonstrate your knowledge and give us the true distance. So you'd have to use a formula, true distance equals map distance times scale, and you'd have to physically use string and the map and interact with it to try and get the answer. So the last verb that we're going to be looking at this cognitive level is the verb interpret. Interpret is like predict. Yes, in a way it is. But what you're going to be doing is you'd have a set of facts. You'd have a scenario. Now, remember, interpret in this case is on the lower cognitive level. So we're not going to evaluate it because that would be the higher cognitive level. That would be in cognitive level 3, where evaluate and create is what you'd need to do. So you'd essentially be providing meaning, or to give or provide the meaning of a set of facts or scenario. So what that would mean is you are given a set of facts, okay? So a bar graph, a pie chart, okay? And you are asked to provide meaning from those facts. This is where you'd have to understand what you're working with. So let's take a scenario. We've got a world map, and on the world map we've got the bar graph of the life expectancy of each country. What we would then look at is we would look at the countries and say, okay, which type of countries would have a higher life expectancy compared to countries that would not have a higher life expectancy. That is when you are interpreting something. So you look at the facts and provide meaning from it. So if you're looking at a country and the success of a country, you would not only look at the physical features like the infrastructure, but you could also look at the political situation within that country to determine its success. So again, if we were looking at that in terms of a bar graph, we would look at the political structure of each country and the way that they are run, and then look at the success or the happiness of the people within that country. And then we would essentially look at the facts or the scenario, and we would provide meaning from that. We would interpret that information. So what we've really done at this point is we've looked at cognitive level 1, and we've looked at the verbs within that cognitive level, and we've given the definition of those verbs. What do they want you to do exactly? So that there's no confusion with aspects like contrast. How can they ask you to contrast if contrast means art, okay? What we're going to look at now is how you can organize your thinking when you see those words. So particularly in my class, I often go, analyze your questions before you answer. Don't just read your work and start answering immediately. You've got to understand what they want from you. So the first step would be those verbs. What do those verbs want from you? What are they instructing you to do? Okay? And when you are organizing your thinking, what is a great thing to do would be to use the thinking maps involved. Okay? So we've got thinking maps that can help us visualize our thoughts. So our thinking maps allow us to visualize what we are looking at, okay? And there are 3 thinking maps that I want to be working with you in this unit. The first one would be the bubble map, okay? This is an example of essentially what is a mind map, what you guys are very familiar with calling a mind map. But for this sake, we can call it a bubble map. And really what a bubble map is where you have the topic in the center, and on the outline sides of it, you would be summarizing aspects or providing key points. Okay? So when you are looking at things like provide a list, you can use a bubble map. If you are identifying something, you could use a bubble map. If you are even defining something and it's got various aspects to it, you can use a bubble map. But there's one other map that you can use if you are trying to list something, okay? Not only list, but also identify, and that is called a circle map. So you love your circle maps, right? Okay, so a circle map is great if you don't need to provide a lot of information, where you're really just looking at keywords. A bubble map is great if you are explaining things. So for an example, when I'm using a bubble map for myself, I would say, okay, my topic would be things like parts of speech. And I would then name my parts of speech, but also define them so that they are categorized. So parts of speech is my topic, and I would say verbs. What are verbs? And I define them and maybe even give an example. And then the next one, nouns. What are nouns and how can I give an example and a definition? So categorizing it is great if you're given a lot of information. But if you're using just one word or one key factor, a circle map is more ideal for that. So a circle map, you give the topic and you really just brainstorm keywords around that specific topic. So an example in English would be, if I'm just wanting to name the parts of speech, is I would have my parts of speech topic in the center, and around it I would simply list the parts of speech. What types of parts of speech are there? Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and that's all I would be providing. So it's a lot less detail, but if I'm asked to provide a list, this is the perfect thinking map to organize my thoughts. So during your exams, if you are trying to list and identify and brainstorm things, perhaps a circle map is the one for you. The other thinking map that you could use would be a double bubble map. So the double bubble map is very similar to a bubble map, but it's a fantastic thinking map to visualize when you are comparing and contrasting aspects. So what we would have our topic here, okay, and then we would have the aspects that are taken off of it, the ideas, our ideas. Now, sometimes there are things that are the same between two aspects, and those would go down the center. The verb that we would be using in that case would be compare. What aspects are the same between the two things I am looking at? And then the outline aspects that are not joined together would be the things that I would be looking at when I am contrasting it. So this part, to summarize, would be compare. How are they the same? And which part are we contrasting? How are they completely different? And this is a fantastic thinking map to use when you are studying natural science and technology. So looking at the skeleton of two different animals, the animals that I have, what parts are the same and what parts are different. In grade 4, you guys would learn about habitats. So you could look at two different habitats and say, okay, in what ways are these habitats the same? And in what ways are they completely different from each other? So this is a fantastic map, thinking map, when you are comparing and when you are contrasting. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. I'm just going to give you one more piece of information about this double bubble map. Okay. There is an alternative to placing it in bubble format like this, and you might have seen it more often or more frequently, and it's called a Venn diagram. But it is essentially exactly the same thing. You use it for the same purposes as well. And it would look something like this. Okay? You have two aspects. What is in the center would be compare, and what is on the outside of it under here would be the contrast. How are they completely different? Butterfly diagram. But no, we don't call it that. It's called the Venn diagram. Okay. Thank you so much for attending this session with me. So just to recap what we looked at today, we looked at the cognitive level 1. We looked at the verbs that we use within that cognitive level and what exactly they're asking of us to do. And lastly, we looked at the thinking maps that you can use when you are using these verbs. Thank you so much. I'll see you again next time.